So we have had from private sector, we had had from research. Now I think it's time to turn over to the civil society. And the next speaker will be Femy Pinto, who's Executive Director for Non-Timber Forest Products Exchange Program in Asia, also known as NTFP. Over to you, Femy. Do we have Femy online?
Yes. Good afternoon, joining you from the Philippines, and greetings from the Non-Timber Forest Products Exchange Program Asia, who we served as the convener moderator for the previous SIANI expert group Wildfoods Biodiversity and Livelihoods Network, and our group activities ran from 2020 until 2021. Well, allow me a minute or two before we present our short video, which would introduce our work made possible with support from SIANI and our perspectives towards more inclusive food systems in Asia. One where wild foods, which are hallmarks of indigenous foodways, are valued, sustainably used, and protected. The Wild Foods Network aimed to bring social and ecological sciences together in enriching understanding on the importance of forests, wild foods, biodiversity for livelihood and food security. We formed a multi-stakeholder group composed of actors from civil society, the academe, indigenous peoples based in Asia, and even other actors from Sweden, primarily SIANI members, with NTFP-EP convening the group for a series of discussions and collaborative work on awareness raising, research, and analysis. We also organized a virtual workshop where we also invited dialogue partners, including from the private sector, donors and policymakers, to join us for an exchange of situations, outlooks, and ideas towards better food systems. Our main objective at the time was to explore wild foods and its linkages to traditional knowledge, tenure, biodiversity and natural resources management, and sustainable livelihoods and health and nutrition. We believe that these are key in the transformation of our food systems and must not be undervalued. We see the importance of knowledge exchanges and the creation of spaces where we can communicate the value of wild foods and forests as important sources for food. We continue to advocate for greater support for indigenous peoples and local communities who are its stewards. Later, the short video that will follow my brief spiel will highlight the vibrancy of traditional knowledge and food systems, and which we draw from examples from the dialogue partners, to emphasize why it is important to mind its links to culture, nutrition, and food security. As a group, we explore the subject through focused dialogues, exploring key questions such as what is the current situation and challenges to wild foods, what are examples of best practices or models, what are the recommendations for more inclusive food systems. We were then able to consolidate a regional situation around wild foods, noting trends and experiences, while at the same time pooling different perspectives and recommendations together. It became very clear that forests and IPLCs play a vital role in addressing the issues of conservation, food security, and poverty. Local systems of indigenous peoples and local communities and foodways are quite strong, but are constantly under threat by the mainstream extractivist economic model of our current food systems. This perspective has been voiced out on many occasions by the IPLCs and allies alike, and it has sparked much more dialogues about what can be done. And spaces have been provided to share inputs for action and policy uptake. The situation remains challenging, especially so for already vulnerable groups who are forced to be on the defensive against giant powers that turn a blind eye on loss of nature, home, and culture in the name of profit and development that is exclusionary. Much has been done, and we celebrate every win, of course, but we also recognize that there is much more to do that will make the vision of inclusive and sustainable food systems achievable by 2030. We have to put in the work, and we really listen to the voices from the forest and the margins who have for generations been able to uphold values of sustainability and deep respect for nature. But we are optimistic that it can be done. When we started, we did not anticipate that we would be holding the activities in the context of a pandemic. And yet we were able to successfully hold rich discussions virtually and contribute inputs on how we can change the ways in which we view food systems. It was also timely that the dialogues were happening around also the dialogue on the food systems the Food Systems Summit itself and the discussions at the World Conservation Congress and around the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework discussions at the Climate COP, and now in the lead up to the Biodiversity COP. This year, too, we continue to elevate our messages at the World Forestry Congress, and we should take up the same in Stockholm 50. The UN Food Systems Summit, Up the Energy Around Food Systems Transformation, calls to action from diverse voices, reiterated the need to think in terms of systems and to recognize our independence. We heard the same from Dr. Delia, and there just needs to be caution and care, especially on how these will be operationalized and on whose terms. Of note was the strong message on the role of science. To this end, we need to continue to speak truth to local actions that are already coming from positions of strength. You'll see that also in the video. We should qualify the kinds of science as suggested, how it is sourced, and also if there are sufficient safeguards in place to protect community intellectual property rights with all these talks of scaling up. So the question is, how can science and traditional ecological knowledge work together and have partnerships based on trust? At the end of the day, we want to have confidence that these processes won't be co-opted, that there is a level playing field where power is brought to the producers and harvesters and not only to scientists and the big food players. So now, on this note, allow me now to share the short video. I hope our technical person will just play the video and listen to the narration. Thank you very much.
Across the indigenous and rural communities of Asia, there exists a deep knowledge about uncultivated or wild foods. These are all edible material found in the wild in both land and water, such as leaves, flowers, fruits, seeds, stems, tuberous, honey, fungi, as well as eggs, fish, and game. These indigenous food systems cover a wide range of processes encompassing identification, harvest protocols, processing techniques, cooking, and knowledge of the terrain. It is a heritage and world in itself, with specific knowledge passed on through generations by watching and doing. A consultation series around wild foods in 2020 to 2021 provided insight that we can learn so much from indigenous peoples and local communities on how to maintain sovereignty over food systems, use resources sustainably, live healthier lives, and be more attuned with nature and its bounty. We had 4 key learnings. First, indigenous knowledge, systems, and practices are the first points of resilience in local food diversity. Many communities continue their practice of shifting cultivation, where forests still remain intact, such as in the Krayan highlands of Borneo, the Karen in Hinladnai and Papay community near the Thai-Myanmar border, and in the Cordilleras and southern highlands of the Philippines. Wild and cultivated foods flourish in diversity and harmony. These food systems are nature-rich. Second, that security of customary tenure is central and a prerequisite to maintain or reclaim the integrity of forests and its resources, including food plants and species. In Southeast Asia, an estimate of at least 15 million hectares are effectively conserved by indigenous peoples and local communities, largely through customary governance systems. Vital legal and policy support, meta-legal and community-led strategies to secure customary tenure over territories of life, or ICCAs, are included in calls to action of forest peoples. Significant efforts are ongoing, including the work on the development of ASEAN guidelines for customary tenure recognition in forested landscapes. This bears key principles such as the protection of customary tenure in order to also secure food and traditional livelihoods. Third, biocultural conservation should be mainstreamed. Further, we could all benefit from a food-focused conservation, where food sources are rejuvenated, restored, or conserved. In the network, we have been working on nurseries, wild food gardens, and the development of harvest protocols for sustainable resource management. Finally, apart from subsistence, wild foods are important sources of livelihoods. Health and nutrition are also areas where wild foods contribute. We The threat of overharvests due to market pressures may lead to unsustainable practices, but scaling up and mean abandonment of core values. The right kinds of markets can be engaged. These markets appreciate that the cost of wild food products are more than just labor. Behind each is the story of seasonality, of traditions, of culture. We have the unique opportunity to educate in each engagement. As a network, this is probably one of the biggest things that we can do. Food systems transformation entails good communication. Behind the positive learnings are challenges that form part of the reality of wild foods, indigenous food systems, and local food diversity in Asia. These rich systems are largely threatened by external forces, invasive enough to cause changes in practices and preferences. Threats of large land acquisitions, climate change, biodiversity and forest loss, and of late, zoonotic diseases, setting up traps and practicing these indigenous food ways. Our agenda, Biodiversity and Livelihoods Network to 2030, is to take some of these recommendations, support and facilitate the protection and restoration of indigenous and local food diversity, and the systems and practices that cultivate them. This includes rotational farming and other food gathering and harvest practices. These dynamic traditions complement the healthy and sustainable management of biocultural landscapes for food and well-being. Linked food production from nutrition and culture by emphasizing quantity over diversity and quality. These links need to be surfaced and awareness must be raised so attention is given to important intangibles like values associated with the collection, production, distribution, and exchange of food. Targeted youth and public awareness about the multifaceted values of wild foods and food must flourish. Examine and transform food policies to consider the biocultural aspects, access and customary rights, and health dimensions relevant to food security. Research blending indigenous, local wisdoms, and science is both innovative and inclusive. Forest field schools, wild food gardens, nurseries, knowledge hubs, and databases. Their tools, practice, and impacts must be part of the documentation and research in order to better inform and transform policy. Finally, community organizations and networks in food and enterprises must be supported through exchange opportunities, active programs, and mobilized resources. Women and youth-led initiatives shall be championed. The security of the world's future food supply and our health and overall well-being will depend on a good understanding of how indigenous peoples and many local communities to sustain themselves through healthy forests, protected food biodiversity, and vibrant food and forest traditions. Let us continue together towards the vision of a more inclusive food systems for people, planet, and prosperity.
Great video, Femy. Thanks for sharing your work.
Thank you.
Content. Thank you.